morning, ladies and gentlemen. It was over. I'm going to ask you to keep that phrase in mind throughout the course of this trial. It was over. On January 1st of 2019, New Year's Day, Alexis Avery told the defendant, Mr. Scanlon, that their relationship was over. They had dated off and on again for several years and tried to make it work. In June of 2018, they got an apartment together at 92 White Street in the city of Westfield, and they moved in. Alexis was pregnant at the time with the defendant's baby, and in August of 2018, a baby girl, Darla, was born. Still, things weren't working out between the two of them. And on New Year's Day, Alexis told the defendant that their relationship had come to an end. On Friday, January 11th, 2019, so just about 10 or 11 days later, Alexis made plans that night to go out with her close friend, Caitlin Avery, who's also her cousin, and you will hear from Caitlin during the course of this trial. They were going to have a girls' night out. It had been a long time. Alexis dropped her baby off at her grandmother's house and borrowed her mother's car, Jessica's car, and you'll hear from Jessica as well. Alexis and Caitlin went back to their apartment on White Street to get ready for the night. So it's about 7 or 8 o'clock. They are doing their makeup and getting dressed and just doing normal things, getting ready for the evening. The defendant, Mr. Scanlon, was there at first, and he was, as you will hear, described by the witnesses, acting mopey and sad and saying things like, "I can't believe my family is leaving." Around 8 o'clock, the defendant went over to his friend's house. Alexis and Caitlin didn't make plans with the defendant. They didn't intend to meet up with him that night. She was looking forward to spending the night with Caitlin. Now, about this same time, Alexis actually changed her Facebook profile to single and started talking to a guy at work that she had a crush on. His name, you will hear, is Scott Burns. And Scott Burns will testify in this case as well. Scott and Alexis worked together, and that night, Alexis and Scott made plans to meet up and have a drink. About 9 p.m., Friday night, Alexis and Caitlin go to a bar in Westfield called the Maple Leaf Cafe, and things are going fine. Scott, the guy she was interested in, and one of his co-workers showed up about an hour or so after Alexis got there, and they were hitting it off. Alexis and Scott were flirting and talking to each other. He was buying them drinks. But you'll hear from Alexis's cousin, Caitlin, that she kept checking her cell phone and was vigilant to see where the defendant physically was, because they shared their location together. And what you will hear is that the defendant was at his friend's house, which is what she anticipated. So at that point, all things were going fine. Now, a little bit later in the night, Alexis and Scott really started to hit it off, and they were at the bar at the Maple Leaf kissing. Sometime around then, the defendant shows up at the Maple Leaf with a friend. Caitlin went over to Alexis immediately and said, "Hey, cool it. Blake just got here." They decided they wanted to go someplace else. So they paid their tabs and they went over to another bar in town. This is probably around 11 or 11:30 now, called Whip City Brewery, or The Whip. So they paid their tabs, they went over to The Whip. They told Scott and his friend where they were going so they could meet up with them. And as they began to walk outside, the defendant rushed after Alexis, and there was a conversation that Caitlin couldn't hear, but again, things seemed fine. Around 11:30 at night, Alexis and Caitlin drove over to the second bar of the Whip, and Scott and his friend showed up shortly thereafter, as was planned. 30 minutes or so after that, the defendant once again showed up at the Whip. And this time he was alone. His friend wasn't there. Caitlin Avery will describe the defendant to you, standing in the corner alone, staring at Alexis and Scott, who were still flirting. And I expect you'll see some pictures of the inside of these two bars. They're not big. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but you'll hear from a Westfield detective who is familiar with both places, obviously, who took some pictures. These are small venues, so it's fair to say that the defendant saw what was happening with Alexis and Scott. At some point in the night, Caitlin Avery actually grabbed the defendant, Blake, who she obviously knew, and brought him outside and said something to him like, "What are you doing? You know you're breaking up." And then the defendant said something like, "How could she do this to me? And why the fuck is that dude hugging her?" Caitlin goes, "Listen, they're co-workers, don't worry about it, it's not a big deal." But again, they're breaking up, so it shouldn't have been. The defendant says, "If I see that shit again, I'm gonna fuck him up." Caitlin goes back inside, finds Alexis, kind of gives her the lowdown. Hey, maybe you want to cool it a little bit with Scott. At some point in the night, Alexis, who you'll hear drove her mother's car to the bar that night, misplaced her key fob. And so she was trying to find her key fob. Caitlin was trying to help her find her key fob. Even the defendant at some point was trying to help her find this key fob for Jessica's mother's car, a Mazda. Now, 1 o'clock in the morning, Alexis kind of disappears from the bar. The defendant was still there. Caitlin was still there. The defendant was asking Caitlin, "Where is she? Where is she? I can't find her." And as it got later and closer to closing time, Caitlin became more paranoid because Alexis was her ride home and she couldn't find her. Alexis and Scott had gone out into the parking lot. They got into the back of his truck and they were having sex, Alexis and Scott Burns. The defendant walked up to Scott Burns' truck, saw what was happening, opened the door, and according to what I expect you'll hear from Scott Burns, in an oddly calm demeanor for what he is seeing, he simply says to Alexis, "Get your things, let's go." But not before she tells Blake Scanlon, "I don't want to be with you, I want to be with him, Scott." The defendant barely acknowledged Scott. He certainly did not fuck him up as he claimed. He simply asked Alexis to get her things. They got into her car and they drove home to their apartment on White Street in Westfield. Caitlin did get home that night, but she never saw Alexis Avery alive again. Nobody did. Because that night, Blake Scanlon murdered her. He waited until they were alone, back at their apartment. Then he got a kitchen knife and he stabbed Alexis Avery 28 times. He stabbed her in the neck, piercing her jugular. He stabbed her over and over again during her midsection. Some of those wounds were so deep that they lacerated and damaged many of her major organs. He slashed her face. He stabbed her in the back. And Alexis had what the medical examiner will describe as defensive wounds, wounds all up and down her arms. The medical examiner will tell you that there was actually literally no blood left in Alexis Avery's heart. She bled out on the kitchen floor of their apartment. Their relationship was over. but the defendant made sure that it was over for Alexis. And if he couldn't have her, nobody was going to have her. The defendant then attempted to injure himself. Can't tell you exactly when during the course of this day or day and a half that's going to be crucial that follows that happened. But he did cut his own wrists, superficial wounds. He even tried to light some debris underneath the gas stove, and you'll hear from an arson investigator about that. But that didn't do anything either. The defendant spent the next day and a half, approximately, delaying, buying time, delaying the inevitable. On Saturday morning, Alexis's mother, Jessica, started to try and contact her. She had to pick up her baby, she had things to do. Pretty normal stuff for a mom to try and contact her daughter, especially since her baby was with her grandmother. And Jessica started to receive replies from Alexis's phone. It started off by saying, "Blake and I aren't feeling great. Can Grandma watch the baby for another night? I just can't. I'm not in a good headspace." And then you'll see numerous calls and texts from Jessica to Alexis Avery's phone throughout the entire course of that day on Saturday. And you will see that those calls and text messages went from concern to alarm to full-blown panic. Because on Sunday morning, Alexis still had not picked up her baby. And Jessica, who you will hear from, Alexis's mother, had a sneaking suspicion, call it mother's intuition, that something was not right. She had not heard her daughter's voice since Friday. She had received text messages from her phone, but she had not heard her voice. At this point in time, Alexis's mother, Jessica, in a last desperate attempt, sends a message at about 11 in the morning to Alexis's phone. Kind of foreboding. She says, "I'm not playing. You know I watch too much Dateline. If I don't hear your voice, I am calling the police and I am coming over there." And that's just before 11 a.m. on Sunday. And at 11:02 a.m., the defendant calls 911 himself. You'll hear that call. It's about 8 minutes long. The defendant calls 911 and tells the 911 dispatcher that he needs help because he had tried to cut his wrists and he was bleeding. And then he volunteers to the 911 dispatcher, "I stabbed my girlfriend on Friday after I caught her cheating on me." Police and paramedics, of course, as they do, when you call 911, show up. The defendant is still holding the phone that he's on the 911 call with at the time. The first officer who responds tells him to put the phone down and make sure that the area is safe and secure. That officer will tell you that he noticed Alexis Avery's body in the kitchen. This is a very small apartment, and you'll see pictures of it. You'll see Alexis Avery was on the kitchen floor, and it was a fairly bloody, gruesome crime scene. The officer approaches the defendant on the couch, who's holding this phone, realizes that he's not in any danger, holsters his weapon, and says to the defendant, essentially, "What happened?" And the defendant, once again, openly admits to Officer Bradley, "I stabbed her on Friday after I caught her cheating." The defendant is evaluated on the scene by paramedics, transported to Noble Hospital, where he is treated and released that same day for superficial lacerations to his wrists. And then a very thorough, as you would expect, investigation ensued. State police became involved in the investigation, Westfield police, The crime scene analysis unit from the state police came and processed the scene. You're going to hear from all of the witnesses about all the work that went into this investigation. And I'm going to suggest to you that the evidence is going to be quite substantial. There will be no question in your minds at the conclusion of this trial as to who killed Alexis Avery in the early morning hours of January 12th of 2019. There will be no question at all about how Alexis Avery died. The medical examiner will tell you 28 sharp force wounds, any number of which were potentially fatal in and of themselves. Once you hear all the facts, listen to all the witnesses, and see all of the evidence in this case, I suggest to you that you will also have no doubts in your mind, no questions at all left, that the defendant committed first-degree murder when he stabbed Alexis Avery 28 times. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green.